Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Dawson, and I'm here to introduce a podcast that I was happy to record with Scott Leavitt, the VP of Academics at Southwest Technical College. I'm also employed here. I've worked here for 5 years. Scott and I have built a great rapport over the years. He's a think tank. We have great conversations, so I was really excited when I could pull him away from his busy schedule just to have a great conversation about education. I want to introduce just a general overview of some topics we discussed. We discussed Horace Mann's concept of education being the Great Equalizer. We discussed social reproduction theory, the distribution of wealth, how to better fund our public education system. We talk briefly about meritocracy. We talk about learned helplessness. We talk about career technical education, which is the field that both of us are currently working in, and how technical education has evolved in recent years. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm not covering. It's about an hour-long podcast. It's really interesting. I've never filmed a podcast before, and you are about to see that because guess who was out of focus the entire time? Me. Yep, I'm out of focus. But the audio is great. I did my best. I still think it's a valuable resource. I'm excited to share it with anybody who wants to listen. And I also wanted to mention a lot of the topics mentioned or discussed throughout this podcast are not easy to digest. And I have not learned about many of them until a year, if that. So I've had to take a lot of time to process these concepts. I've read a lot, I've written a lot, I've done a lot of research on these topics. I feel well informed in these topics, but because I am fairly new to studying such topics, sometimes verbalizing my ideas or my counter arguments to some of what Scott presents is not the easiest. And I did notice while through editing the podcast that there were moments where I wish that I could have presented more research and verbalize my counter argument a little bit better. So I'm not perfect. I do recognize that I could have brought more to the table. But with that said, I think we both had a very mutually beneficial conversation. He has a neoliberalism approach to education. He's very economic in his thinking. He has a entrepreneurial spirit, if you will. And I have a very opposite approach to public education. So that's why this conversation is so interesting. A lot of the things that we talked about, we disagreed on many of the subjects. But that's what makes for good discussion. So on that note, I'm going to stop yapping. I hope you guys enjoy. And I'm going to edit this, but I think cue the music and let's get started. Fancy we are.
I know.
What are we doing?
I feel like we should have a podcast.
We probably should. I think that's what we're doing right now. I think we have a podcast as of today. Okay, so my name is Hannah Dawson, as you know, and your name is Scott Leavitt. What's your official title? VP of Academics?
Yes, Vice President of Academics.
At Southwest Technical College.
Southwest Technical College.
Yes. So, and how long have you worked here?
So we were just figuring this out the other day. I'll be 7 years in November. So time is flying. But I'm doing a different role now than when I started. When I started, I did custom fit and community education, and kind of all of our short-term trainings and professional development for employers. And so then I transitioned a year ago to this new role where now we're still kind of overseeing that piece of it, the Innovation Center, and then now all of our programs, kind of the whole piece of it now.
So you transition from, and short-term training, so that's like kind of corporate training? Is that a synonymous term or?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any training that employers are doing to upskill their employees or retrain them, then we're a piece of that. So corporate training is a pretty good word for that as well.
Okay, so I have my little reference sheet here, and I may skip ahead because there's a good segue from that.
Great.
So you and I have had several discussions, especially like regarding corporations, because you're also a very entrepreneurial spirit, so
Yes.
you have a lot to say. Okay, so there's this thing within education that I've been learning about, public education specifically, where education is being commodified. Does that resonate with you at all? Do you know what that means, or is it like a elusive term?
Well, typically speaking, commodities are something that you can't compete on, right? Like, for example, milk, right? It's a commodity in the sense that as you make milk or more of it, the only way to really change it or alter it to try to have any kind of competitive edge, it's very difficult to have a competitive edge, right? Selling something like that. So
Right.
It's a commodity, from what I understand.
So do you feel that there's a sense of that within our public education system, that competitive nature?
Well, to a degree, I mean, education is really geographic, right? Now that's starting to change, but especially if you're talking about the public ed, K through 12, more often than not, students are sort of confined to where they live, and that's where they're busing, and that's where they're going to school. So there's not a lot of option. I mean, there is some private schools that crop up, and you have charter schools. So it's not entirely a commodity.
So can I just ask a question? Just
Yeah.
elaborate a little further. So how do you feel charter schools, and what was the other example you gave? Private schools. How does that affect public education?
I don't know that it does. I don't, and now I'm not in that world specifically, but it feels very much like they're just separate things. The public education has a role, right? It's free for the most part if you discount fees and other things. They are given the task of providing education for every student, regardless of financials, of race, and all these other things, right?
Right.
Gender. Whereas private schools really can target specific demographics, usually those who have wealth, and so they serve a little bit different niche. And then charter schools would probably be, I would say, the most similar in regards to who they're trying to serve. But they tend to, from my understanding, just do things just a little bit different, kind of outside the normal mold of what public education is.
Right. And so just to clarify, like, you've never worked K through 12. You've always been in higher education.
Correct.
So throughout my master's degree, I've learned a lot about the public education system. Some of it is very daunting and depressing, but I think it's good things to learn. So what I've learned, and obviously this is opinion, but some could say that it's also not, it's just reality, is that choice schooling is dangerous for public education because over the last 20 years, private schools, the government has funded them more so than they have in the past, which essentially means it's like choking the funds that goes into the public education system. So like there's this debate on whether choice schooling is something that should exist, and if and how it has an impact on our public education system. So with that said, like, can you see that point of view?
Yeah. So basically you're saying there's a concern or a fear that you're going to spread resources too thin, and that public education relies to some degree on the economies of scale of having so many students in that it works. And the more you pull resources from that one main system, the more that system's going to struggle. I mean, I see that. I would probably contend a little bit that some of that choice, right? If parents are choosing to send their students elsewhere in a competitive environment, I think it ups everyone's game a little bit. Like you're just forced to compete, even though I'm making almost a counter argument to what I made a minute ago of public ed kind of existing on its own.
Right.
You're sort of tying that back in now with competing resources. I think that there's room for both to exist, and sometimes putting all of your eggs in one basket and creating a system where there really isn't any need to compete at all is probably worse, right? I think we exist a little bit in that system now, where even though students have choice, there's voucher systems that exist. I don't necessarily see that as stripping resources away, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do see it as you do force a little bit of creativity. There is a tipping point, right? If everyone was taking their choice and going somewhere else, then at some point public institutions or public ed would falter, right?
And sorry to interrupt, but
You're
I think
good.
that's the fear, however. So there's an increase, like I said, of state funding into private schooling and like voucher systems. Just recently, the state of Maine ruled in favor for voucher schools. And the concern is, yeah, that competitive nature, like I could see where you're coming from, can be healthy just for a creative aspect. But the fear is that it's like almost Pandora's box. You've opened it, and now where does it land? And where does the funding stop, right? And our schools are already underfunded. They're understaffed throughout the COVID pandemic specifically. But, I mean, the COVID pandemic had just highlighted so many things that are necessary within public education system. This is how a lot of students are getting fed. It's safe transportation. Like so many resources that are not even academic come from public education. And so to take away those resources or funding that leads to those resources is like a very, I think it's scary. I don't think it's good.
Interesting. So as you think about that, right? And again, I am not an expert in public ed.
We're here to have a good conversation.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting because at the end of the day, we want the best outcomes, right, for students. And if there's a system that's creating greater outcomes, right, I see value in helping fund those systems. Now, if it's only funding private education that a ton of students can't afford, and so you wind up creating two separate classes where everyone who could even remotely afford it is going over to a system that's doing it better, and more choice is pushing that direction. People are voting with their money to send students there. I can see a little bit of danger in what's left over, and as far as equality and open access for all students go. But I think that there's a lot to be learned, and my hope, or the aspirations that I would hope to see, is that if an institution was really losing that many students, public ed was in danger of really losing all economies of scale, that they would be looking at what other institutions were doing and beginning to replicate it.
Right.
Now, overall, the reality is, institutions with wealthier students and more privileged people moving into those institutions will likely hire, they'll be able to pay more for teachers, have better resources for students, and you're going to see outcomes shift, right? And I don't think anyone wants to see that, but I think the argument that we're trying to debate is whether or not it's okay to level the playing field and pull some people down and pull some people up and be here, or whether or not this exists anyway, and it's okay if it does this. But I think the reality is when you lose resources, you get that gap spreads? It's a challenging and a very tricky question.
As are most things in education, have I been learning
Yeah.
as I've been learning.
Yeah.
So I think another huge concern is that with choice schooling, such as charter, voucher, private, it's fragmenting public education, right? So we want to democratize education, equalize opportunity for all of our students. And if we have all of these other resources where students or families with more money are going elsewhere, then that automatically makes it more difficult to democratize our public education system. Have you heard of Horace Mann?
No.
Okay, so in 1848, he talked about education being the Great Equalizer. The Great Equalizer meaning anybody could pull themselves out of poverty, people could find a good career, people could build a home and a family and find all of their aspirations through public education. Obviously, this was in 1848, and obviously that is not true. The public education system does not serve that. And I guess before stating that so bluntly, like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I still believe education, even public education, is the great equalizer.
Okay.
Now, what doesn't happen, and I think something that you can't fully expect to happen, is that everyone's going to leave a public education or private education and end up exactly the same, right? People come inherent with qualities that make them different, right? And so I think that equality in education and an equalizer is more about, two thoughts here. So the first is what equality is in general, right? And providing equal and access to the most people to education, and as far as you can, an equal quality of education. You're going to have some students excel within that framework and some students who don't. And you're going to have students that come in that may need more time, that may need more resources. And there's a lot of people who would argue that by providing students who need more resources, you're giving them the equal opportunity. But is that equality in education? Or is equality in education providing everyone with the same level of education and then seeing what they can do or make of it, right? So there's kind of a question about the equality there as to what is equality, right? And then the second thing is, and I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Regarding the other one, but I think it's debatable as far as what equality actually looks like, and the results from it. Oh, the Great Equalizer.
Right.
The Great Equalizer is just that I think it's shown over the course of history that education is the way, right, to change people's status, to change their position, to change their outlook. And in that regard, that's what education is doing, right? You can take kids from all different backgrounds. You give them opportunities to learn. So to that degree, I think education is the great equalizer. Now,
Okay.
Are we perfect at that? No.
Right. So I disagree with most of what you just said.
Awesome.
And that's okay. That's why you're here, so we could have a great discussion. So education being the great equalizer. The problem with that is it kind of ties into meritocracy. So meritocracy assumes only one variable, right? But there's many variables. So truly, I think it doesn't start with education as far as being able to excel in life and get what you need. I think it starts in the home. So there's these issues of intergenerational poverty, right? There's students that go home to an abusive household and don't have the mind space or possibly any space to study. We lack extracurricular and out-of-school program funding, which is another, that we could make that argument to why private schooling is not great. So what I'm saying is ultimately poverty and what's happening within the household is ultimately, again, what leads a student to be able to access resources and have better opportunity and things of that nature. So I feel like a lot of us are trying to solve so many social problems through education, but we're not targeting the true issue, which is poverty.
Right. So is your suggestion then to pull funding from education and place it there?
I do think that if we put some of the funding towards the home and bringing people out of poverty, then that would lead to a better education system. But the question is, where do we find the money? So your question was, do we pull funding from public education to then fund people of poverty, right? But then we get into welfare, which has become like this dirty word that people don't like to talk about.
So, okay, let's go there. Let's say welfare. Let's say welfare wasn't a dirty word and it was fine, and we could talk about welfare as being support you give to people.
Right.
So you feel like by providing someone welfare, right, money into the home, pump money into individual homes, that those individuals are going to be more apt to help their children in school?
I think that they would have better access to resources to be able to excel in school.
So, like, what type of resources are you referring to?
So, food, money, so a lot of people are living strictly out of survival, right? They don't have time. When you're in survival mode, you're not like, oh, let me get good grades. It's like, wait, where's my next meal coming from? Right? So just the basic fundamentals. And there's more resources, I'm sure. And if I thought long enough, I could come up with more. But even there's so many people within the United States, the statistics are insane. People living under the poverty line or at the poverty line. I don't want to say a statistic because it's probably going to be wrong, but it's a lot of people. And these are people that just don't have the basic necessities to survive. So how are they expected to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and break the glass ceiling? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think the reality is even as I'm talking about education being the great equalizer and agreeing with that, I don't think it's the only variable, right? That's not the only thing that equalizes. Like I said, geography, right? That changes a lot.
Property tax.
Right. There's a lot of things that go into it, but the reality is without it, like, what does society look like without it?
Right. And
Right.
So I'm not saying, I think both need to be funded more so than they are right now. I think more people need access to more resources to have a better household, and more money needs to go into schools to have better teachers, better technology, better everything, right? So these children that are coming from a household that hopefully is not in poverty are available to access those resources and take advantage of those resources.
Right. I think the realities that we face is that money's not unlimited, resources are not unlimited, and I mean, there's a lot of things that you could throw money at would make it better, but the reality is we live in a world where that doesn't exist, right? So, in that environment, in that world, like, I think we're trying to make do, and we're saying, here's this. This is for SNAP and other food programs for those who need it. Schools, we're going to give you programs to feed students because we know they do better on a full stomach than an empty stomach. There's a lot of resources that we're allocating currently because those help, but at the end of the day, like, there is some personal responsibility that individuals have to take, not only as families but as even students, and you see that, and some again, not everyone ends up coming out of that process equal. They go into it with different life experience, different environments, different homes, different everything. But we do know that we have to try, we have to do our best to pull people up to whatever level we can. Now, some students, no matter what resources you provide in school, do not have support at home, right?
Right.
So we know that this exists. And I don't know, I mean, I've never seen the research behind it. I don't know how many times we've funded homes directly and saw results in the schools. That's not familiar to me. So if you have that research, that would be awesome to hear.
Yeah.
But we do live in a world, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we live in a world with limited and finite resources. That, I mean, we have to have limits somewhere. So where you fund, I'm just glad I don't have that position. That's for our politicians.
Right.
I'm glad I don't have that job.
Yeah. If only that we had more effective and efficient people of power, right?
Well, and I don't even know it's effective or efficient. It's just they've got a different perspective, right? Like, for example, my perspective is in higher ed and in, the technical education world. And so I look at it and I see the good that this does. And so I'm going to fight. And when I see resources go somewhere else, I think, oh man, they just don't know. But I don't have the same perspective. I'm not getting the same information that they're getting from people that are workforce services, education, higher ed, public ed, the private schools. Like, they've got people lobbying them from every direction, wanting money and wanting resources to help with what they do. And they will all make valid arguments as to why the resources should go there versus elsewhere. And I would make the same argument for education, which is why my perspective is probably tilted a little bit toward, yeah, there's stuff going on in the home. I get that. But
this
is really important, right? The education piece of this is really important.
Absolutely. There are several instances where teachers and students have taken it into their own hands, like grassroots activism, and a short turnover rate where funds were given like that, right? After a lot of hoopla was made, for lack of a better term. So I think, yes, we do have finite resources. We're not in a world that's just made of money. However, I do think that politicians and people that have the power to manage budgets are capable of funding education more. And I think to think otherwise is absolutely silly.
So you think they're capable of funding more?
Absolutely.
So where do they take it from?
There's budget all over the place, right? To reallocate budget is not unheard of. Very common practice in bureaucracy.
So where would you pull from?
I don't know. I'm not a politician.
I think that's the trick is I think it's really easy to think.
But, okay, wait.
That we can pull money from places. Not so easy.
I know it's not so easy, but why in these instances of activism have they thrown their hands in the air and been like, okay, here's a X% salary increase for teachers of the state of Arizona, right? Like, why are they able to do that? Obviously, they're able to reallocate funds. It's not impossible.
Definitely not impossible, but by allocating more funds to teachers in Arizona, that means you're not allocating funds somewhere else. It's always a choice. Right. It's not both. It's one of those, you can't have cake and eat it too, right? Like, if you're going to eat your cake, you can't have it at some point. And I think that again, that's a challenging, very challenging, because I've worked in different levels of government I haven't just been in education. I've worked for a local government, or a regional. And even there, all of our programs, we argued tooth and nail why they had to be funded, why the people that were employed in those had to be funded, why the direct funding had to be funded to clients. And we could make every bit as valid arguments for that as education or as what you're talking about, welfare, or whatever else that you're trying to fund. Again, you're pulling from somewhere. You're taking a job or resources from somewhere to fund it somewhere else.
Right. And we all know that there's like the wealth gap, right? So what if we were able to better disperse money so there weren't the richest of the rich and then people living in poverty? Like, why is that so unheard of? So these huge corporations that are being funded by the government, lobbyism, things of that nature, like, why is it unheard of to take some of that money and put it towards welfare and public education? So you're taking some of their jobs, but like, we're also talking about millionaires here. Who needs that much money to survive?
Right. I don't think anyone needs that much money. I think it's a matter of who's going to be more effective with the money. I heard something recently that changed a little bit of my perspective on this. So a 501c3 is a nonprofit organization, and someone said the other day that there is a lot writing on that status in the IRS as a 501c3 indicates that the government feels like the tax money that they would collect from you is actually better served staying with you. That you are doing a good enough job that you would do more with that money than the government would going back to the government, where then they can put strings and have certain requirements and push the money back out.
So we have a lot of different opinions, and I think you're wrong.
Perfect.
But that is okay. And I don't think the government is efficient and effective in dispersing funds. I don't think that we should trust the government that heavily. So we're left with this very sticky scenario of how do we get people the funding that they need without using the government?
Well, so this is just my opinion, but I find it fascinating. So, for example, just as I was talking, and I made reference to something that I think that a lot of people don't fully consider, that the richest people in the world, that's a valuation, right? That the money's not sitting there in their pockets.
No.
That there's only, from the last time I had researched this, about $3 trillion in digital money, in U.S. currency, and about $3 trillion in actual physical currency. That's all that exists, $6 trillion. That's it. So that money, as it's moving from hand to hand to hand to hand, is what creates value. It's what creates everything that we build. And so someone like Jeff Bezos may only have $1 million of liquid cash sitting somewhere. The reality is most of his money is at play. It's at work. He's got money in stocks. He's got money in equipment and in other things, which means he's not actually sitting on any cash.
No, but okay,
This is important because that money that's not sitting there, that's just open cash to take from Jeff Bezos and then give to someone else, that's money he's already given to other people, right? The minute you buy a truck, you just paid all the workers in an automobile factory. The minute you buy stocks, you just paid someone else that sold you the stock. So all of this cash is flowing around. So what happens when you're talking about just creating extra funds to fund people, right? When you're talking about creating value, you have to pull that from somewhere. And when you do that, the cold reality is, and we just saw it with COVID, is the minute everyone has $3,000 or so in their bank accounts, they spend it, because that's what happens, because saving is an awful idea when it comes to economics. So when they spend it and you flood an economy full of cash, now everyone wants services. No one can get them. Everything runs out of stock because everyone's buying in inordinate amounts because supply chains can't keep up. Now things are inflating, right? So all of this that we're seeing right now is our direct results of giving money directly to people in a mannerism that's not sustainable. That's the reality.
I don't disagree with you. However, that doesn't solve the problem of public education not getting enough funding, and also the wealth gap. So how do we get people out of poverty?
But that's the question, though.
And let's tie this back to education.
Okay. And I think just going back to how we get people out of poverty, which, again, as you educate, as you give them the ability to work and have skills that are valuable, then people who have wealth will pay for those skills and the value.
That's a very So
by wealth, I mean business owners, right?
You're explaining like meritocracy, essentially.
Yeah, very likely.
Based on merit, you work your way up.
Right, or your way out, right? You receive education, you gain a skill.
So what if there are more variables than merit? Social reproduction theory. You come from a home that doesn't have... Actually, let me read you this.
Okay.
So this is an example of social reproduction theory. I wrote this myself, so I don't have to cite it. Student A comes from a low-income household and may work to support their family instead of studying in school, while student B comes from a high-income household where there is less responsibility and more time to study. Student A will likely receive lower scores than student B, which may lead to them not getting accepted to a quality college or perhaps any college at all, in comparison to the college that student B attends. Student A may never receive college credentials, as tuition is very high and unlikely to be manageable within their budget. With a lack of credentials, student A will not receive as a high-paying job and has a higher chance of remaining in poverty. Contrastingly, student B has a greater chance at receiving the higher-paying job, even though they're in less need of it due to their high-income background. This hypothetical example highlights why meritocracy goes against democratic education, for there are several factors that affect a student's life and their ability to access resources. Meritocracy assumes that everybody has equal access to all resources. This assumption is simply untrue. So in essence, the amount of cultural knowledge and status one has will alter their life experience. This leads some to more availability to resources, while others are left without access to resources. Right? So does that's an example, a hypothetical one, as to why merit is not the only variable. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's not the only variable that exists, but again, I just go back to like the realities of what we face in life, right? As you move forward as student A and student B in the example you gave, you don't always start in the exact same place. But I think what your analogy really hits home on is going back to education, right? Like at the end of the day, education's the way out, right? Like
if they're able to afford tuition, if they're able to have study time at home and not take care of their younger siblings or get beat up by their parents, if they're able to, and this is the reality of many students. Like, we are both in a place of privilege. These are not things that we deal with.
Right. So I will say this, and this is just an interesting thing, because I think that there are gaps, but I think the gaps exist probably not where most people think to look. As an example, the poorest students qualify for grants. Like, this is set up in our government, right, to address these very things. They qualify for grants and they qualify for income and money to pay for college, right? It's intentional, and it's set up so that they can do it. The highest income earners can pay for it. Oddly enough, those who struggle the most, I would say, with college, affording tuition in college, lie somewhere in the middle class, where they don't probably have enough money to pay, but they also don't qualify for any help.
Right. So have you ever heard the term learned helplessness?
No.
So it's like a social human behavioral thing, but it's basically where a person is told over and over again that they're unable to do whatever they're trying to do. And then they're put in this position where they feel incapable of doing so. Working at Southwest Technical College, I see it all of the time. We deal with a lot of impoverished students. Iron County is the second poorest county in the state. We attract students that can't afford college tuition. And frankly, these students never felt like they would be able to apply for any grant. They don't even have availability to resources that educate them on how to apply for a FAFSA, or aka a Pell Grant, right? So when you're put in this position where you have no resources, or not no resources, but limited resources, how likely is a person like that going to be familiarized with the process of moving forward with a grant? You know what I'm saying? Like, and the reason why I said Southwest Tech is because I do see it all the time. People assume it's hard for them to even walk in the door because they assume that because they are poor and they do not have money, that they cannot obtain any higher educational credential. So they don't even move forward, which is a prime example of learned helplessness.
Right. So we exist in a system where the resources are available, right?
Right.
But people aren't getting them because of this learned helplessness or whatever you want to call it. So where is the problem in that scenario then?
I think the problem lies in accessibility, right? So how do we market this big scary thing of like government grants to people that feel like they don't deserve anything, essentially? Do you see where like the direction I'm trying to take this?
Yeah.
And I see it all the time with my own students. It's hard to get people to even walk through the door because they don't understand that they can attend higher education. People don't even take that step forward because it's ingrained in their brain that like, oh, that is not for me. That is for people that are in a different class and have more money than me.
Right. And I think that's where the challenge really comes in, is even going back to what we were talking about earlier, like with where you put the resources. I think in a lot of cases the resources already exist. It's just whether or not people are getting, if they're accessing them or not.
Accessibility.
But I don't know, how do you increase access to that? How do you educate more? It goes back to, right, how do you let people know these are available? Usually
and teach them how to
yeah,
go through the
and
process.
I 100% agree that students do that. I know they do that. We had an interview with a lady. This has been a few months ago, and the results of that interview, as part of a bigger survey, she talked about not knowing that there were grants or loans, or had no idea about higher education.
Exactly.
And so I get that. I don't know, though, but going back to where you put the resources, there's resources to help poor people. Like I mentioned, there's resources for food in the home. There's resources. Our government, I feel like, has done a fairly good job of allocating resources, but most of the people who need them the most don't know that they exist. That's a problem.
I could agree with that. I haven't really thought of it that way, and so I feel like not in a position to elaborate. But accessibility is a huge thing.
Right?
But I
tricky.
still have a hard time believing that the government's doing its job. Call me cynical, but yeah. I mean, okay, sidebar, I guess, but do you think democracy and capitalism can coexist?
Yes.
Can you see maybe a counter argument as to why potentially they don't coexist?
No.
So for me, capitalism leads to like the wage disparity, right? People having a bunch of money and then a lot of people having no money. And to me, like, that is not democratic, right? In a lot of ways.
Okay.
Oui, non? Tu parles français?
I guess I don't see those as being mutually exclusive, right? I don't see how democracy, in the sense of being, right, able to vote, able to pick your leaders, in what democracy actually what that is.
For the people.
Sure. But I don't understand how capitalism would be contrary to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Like, they can exist simultaneously. Like, one doesn't necessarily, like, if you're looking at democracy as being a purely equal society and everyone has exactly the same thing, I would argue that's not democracy. That's something different.
Right.
So capitalism, yeah, it creates a lot of things. It definitely can create a wealth gap, but you can also have a democratic system that regulates that, right?
Do you think that that's the system that we currently live in?
We're in an interesting mix. Like, I think there's quite a bit of socialism in the society we live in, and it's not all just capitalism, right? We have Medicare and Medicaid and we have programs, and we have all of these things that really are social safety nets, and it's very socialistic, to be honest. There's a lot of that goes on, and then we've got a hybrid mix between that and pure capitalism, where people do, and you get rewarded for things you create, for value creation, but then a lot of that reward, rich people still pay taxes for the most part, as well as middle class. So that money gets reallocated into social systems and other programs. So I would say we're a firm hybrid system, to be honest.
I wish that I had, because I have all of these ideas that I can't explain, which is really horrible being a host of a podcast. I'm like, you're right, but actually, Scott, I think you're wrong, and I can't tell you why, but we'll have to come back to this conversation.
Yeah.
So I want to talk specifically about technical education, the career that we have both found ourselves in.
Perfect.
How do you feel that technical education impacts the greater educational sphere, if at all?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it does. And, just as we're talking about gaps and social stratus and all this other stuff, their education has different needs, right? You have doctors and lawyers and philosophizers, and there are a lot of jobs that require a degree and a university education. But alongside those doctors are people that are surge technicians and nurse assistants to help. And there's a lot of technical education there that fills in a lot of those gaps between jobs and careers. Just like there's need for welders and computer programmers, and there's truck drivers. All of these things are just required for society to function in any given day. And a lot of these careers and jobs don't require you to go take a whole bunch of general education and move along those lines. So yes, absolutely, there is a need for technical education. And another thing that I've seen tech ed do, because so much of our training is not just the hypothetical or the theory behind, it's the hands-on, hands-dirty education. And I have seen students who, like you, that come in feeling like they've failed, because most of our public ed is geared around people that learn through the theory and can move into a degree-granting institution where it's a little more theory. And so they come here thinking they're a failure, that they're not smart.
Learned helplessness.
And you show them that, yes, you actually can learn by putting your hands on things, that it's a valuable education, and that learning is real. It's the real deal, as we say around Southwest Tech. And that can spark confidence. And, a couple of years back, we had a student who came kind of in that same scenario, started working in welding, and had an instructor say, "You're truly gifted. Like you're brilliant, and I think that you could make a great engineer." And that student, after graduating with his welding certificate, went to SUU in the engineering program, someone who was not great in school, but the extra support, understanding that they could actually do this, and that confidence, that student ended up being the valedictorian at SUU. And that's the type of story that I firmly believe in, the hands-on approach, and in a different type of education that suits student strengths differently than the traditional method of education.
Right. I think it certainly diversifies the educational sphere. I also see a lot of students, so many students that come to me that feel like that they lack worth. And just for example, the other week I had a student finish my class, and his departing words were, "Thank you for believing in me." And which made me cry, A, but B, I went home angry, because I was like, why am I the first person to make this adult man feel as though somebody believes in him? Like, how could the public education system fail you that greatly that this is the first time that you feel like somebody believes in you? And I think it's a great example as to how structured our public education system is. As you said, it's theory and like it kind of builds for us to get into university. But not everybody's built to be Shakespeare, as I like to say. And you don't need to go into hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And you don't need to be made to feel stupid because you don't belong in a university setting. So one thing that I've been saying, and I want to hear your thoughts on it, and then we'll start wrapping up, is I've only been working in education for 5 years. And I have seen with my eyes, within such a short amount of time, like a paradigm shift with education. Technical education, or CTE, career technical education, is becoming more acceptable and is playing on the same field as university education. Whereas in the past, we were kind of the underdogs, right? People would kind of scoff at a technical degree. College certificate. And now, especially with Southern Utah University and Southwest Technical College collaborating, it kind of made waves through the state of Utah, arguably across the nation, seeing university and tech come together when previously tech was, as I said, the underdog. So is this something that you've witnessed?
Yeah, same. So 7 years. And I think there's a very real movement, right? And so I'm definitely someone that thinks and believes that the market tends to self-correct. And I think for so many years, everyone was taught, go to a university, get a degree, go do that. Harvard's done a study that shows that there are 7 jobs that require a high school education or certificate, or an associate's degree, kind of a shorter education, to every one job that requires a 4-year degree. And I think what happened is there was an overrunning of the other, right? The pendulum swung way too far for one direction. And you're going to see that naturally start coming back, because when there's no one to do the electrical work and there's no one to do plumbing, those jobs are going to start paying more. It's economics, right? Supply and demand.
Right.
And as so many people graduating with college degrees have found out that not more often than not, but a lot of times their degrees, they're working in fields that aren't directly related. Now, again, education is great in the sense that it can prep you. And once you know how to learn, and once you've got that environment, or you've attained some level of education, it does allow you to go and do a plethora of jobs that may not be directly related to your degree. I'm one of those.
Me too.
Degree in biology, chemistry, and here I am doing this. But for years I did other work as well. So I do feel like education prepared me in many ways. But there are certain skills that I don't have, that I would have to learn specifically how to do. As I mentioned, electrical or plumbing or welding or cooking. There's a lot of those things that you learn them in an environment like ours, and there are a ton of jobs, but you need these. And so again, we've just seen the pendulum, I think, shift back. And as it's shifted, and as a state, our state leaders are looking at the economy and saying, we're imbalanced. And so they've put significant effort into not only combining us as a higher education institution, all of us, with degree granting, to help people look at that and view us on the same playing field.
Let me elaborate real quick. So previously, technical colleges in Utah and universities in Utah had separate governing boards. And they have now come. So USHE, Utah System of Higher Education, was over university. What was the technical college?
It was UTech.
Yes, UTech, which is now Dixie, but we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah.
So now, recently, with 2 years, a year and a half?
About 2 years ago, the governance changed. They combined the two systems into one. So we are all now part of USHE. And you alluded to the SUU Southwest Tech partnership, which we call dual enrollment. And that the whole course-to-course articulations and what we're doing with SUU really has been something. It's been a model, and I think that that's also helped pave the way a little bit to some of this larger conversation. But when you have all of these forces at work between the economy, the pendulum that swung so far, the need to collaborate more with our universities within our regions, it made a ton of sense to combine these systems, I believe.
Right.
And again, it helps elevate tech education to that next level where, it is the first choice for a lot of students, and not just I didn't get into a university, so I'm going to go do tech ed. There's a lot of brilliant students that come directly to here, and this is their first choice. And a lot of them also want to go to university, but they know that they can start here, they can gain a skill that's valuable, and from that they can be working and earning more money while they're getting a degree and pursuing other career options as well. So it really is a great jumping off point. For some people it's a jump off and that's where they stay, and others they continue their educational pathway. And that's what I love about being in the environment we're in right now with tech ed, is it really is that place.
It's so fun and innovative, and I started working here when I was 21 years old, which is crazy. And just to see everything mold and develop, and I'm like, I'm not old enough to see all of these changes, but it's right before my eyes and it's crazy. But I like how you said that the system naturally kind of corrects itself, which it always does, and the pendulum swings. So everybody until recently was told you have to go to university in order to be successful. And I think just recently that has changed. And thank goodness for that, right? Now we could recognize and understand and diversify the educational sphere that is attainable to more groups of people rather than just people that would attend university. So
yeah, and I love that you touched on that, because we do talk a lot about the equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's an important piece of most of our conversations, because as you talk about equality in education, that is a major component to getting students here, as to how we treat them, how accessible our programs are, and how we treat people, to be honest, to make sure that they do have equity in coming here and learning. And that always is a piece of the conversation. Always.
Yeah, and I think we kill it. I think we've done a good job.
For those of you listening, there was a fist bump. I think we do a really good job at that. And even just the things that are natural and inherent in the fact that we're a different option. We talked about earlier about some people that are just better with different types of education. And this is an environment that's different than traditional education, going through that higher ed path. So this is higher education with your hands for the most part. And we do see a diversity of students here because of it.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for it. So it's been a great conversation. I think we're going to wrap it up. I could talk to you forever. You know that.
Same.
Yeah. There's a lot of things I didn't touch base on, but I think we touched base on enough. And who knows, maybe we'll make this a series, Scott. You and I could just become influencers on the internet and maybe quit our education jobs. Just kidding.
That's funny.
All right. Well,
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you for inviting me.
Of
Thanks.
course. See ya.